Yes, absolutely. But just to give you a number for those that listen about the de-dollarization, until a couple of years ago, the latest data by the IMF indicated that the US dollar was around 55, 56% of the global reserves.
Right.
Now, latest data indicated that the dollar has gone below 50%, which means
Okay.
it dropped around 6-7% over the last year, like very much when the war again in Ukraine started and Western sanctions were applied against Russia. So the numbers already indicate that we are entering into a process, a phase of de-dollarization. Now the question is, why would and should the Europeans and the Chinese be interested in supporting this trend towards de-dollarization? We have to distinguish the two actors. China does it in order to challenge the predominant position of the United States in the world, and of course, the internationalization of the Chinese currency challenges the dollar, which is the ultimate symbol of American power in the world. For the Europeans, is different because the Europeans are loyal allies of the United States, but the challenge that they have against the dollar has more to do with the willingness and the desire by the Europeans to lessen the reliance on, for instance, the Federal Reserve, which means it will allow the Europeans to be less reliant on America's economic cycle. But also, in the case of the Europeans, more than challenging the dominant position of the United States, is more about gaining independence when it comes to pursue independent economic policies and foreign policy. An example, when the Europeans were trying to negotiate and salvage the Iran's nuclear dossier, if you remember some years ago, the Europeans with the Russians, the Chinese,
right,
and to some extent the Americans tried to find a deal with Iran on developing civilian nuclear capabilities. Now, the Trump administration walked away from the accord called the JPO, so the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, leaving the Europeans to decide what to do. One of the terms was that Iran had to be helped financially, economically, in order to comply with the accords. The issue of sanctions became important. The Trump administration imposed sanctions on any company, entity that would trade with Iran. At that point, the Europeans that would still rely quite a lot on the dollar could not save the Iran deal. Had Europe or the financial system be more used to using euros, then the history could have been different. In other words, I'm saying that for the European Union, in particular the Eurozone, the members that have of the EU that have accepted to use the European common currency, using its own common currency in global trade and financial transactions would also support their foreign policy. And therefore, the de-dollarization elements inside Europe have much less to do with the weakening of America's promise in the world, much more to do with their desire to emerge as a global power. So Europe is a global power and use the euro as an instrument of foreign policy. And this is important to underline because whereas in the case of China, the challenge is not only financial, but also more geopolitical and much larger. In the case of the Europeans, is really limited to the idea to have the euro as a tool for foreign policy. And of course, lessening the reliance on the dollar would help this development. So, but the other aspect which needs to be understood is that both Europe and China, even if they come from different positions when it comes to create a world where the dollar would be less predominant, even if they come from different positions, they have common interest when it comes to create a multipolar monetary system. How have they done it? Well, first of all, I mentioned before that during the Eurozone crisis, we had the intervention of China to support the Eurozone. That was not new because when in 1999 the euro, the European common currency, was launched, China almost immediately said that it was a very good and welcome development in world politics, because China immediately saw in the emergence of the euro as the potential of creating a multipolar currency system. So already from the beginning, China has supported the Eurozone for strategic reasons. During the Eurozone crisis, in particular in 2012, 2013, when speculative attacks were made against Eurozone members, China would intervene politically by issuing statements in favor of buying Eurozone bonds, even if it was just statements, so we don't know what they made. There have been indications from people, both within the IMF and national governments that I had the pleasure to meet and interview, that in reality, actually, China intervened in the financial markets, and that China would invest sums to sustain the Eurozone and the parity between the renminbi and the euro. Why? Again, strategic reasons.
Yeah, sure.
The idea to have Eurozone that would also challenge the dollar, but also for economic reasons. By keeping up the value of the euro, China would lower the value of the renminbi. Hence, Chinese exports in Europe would be cheaper. So that would also help China's trade balance. So you do have these two drivers, strategic reasons, but also basic national interest. Now, at the same time, after the Eurozone crisis, we also had another interesting development, and in this case, from the side of the Europeans. In July 2015, the Chinese currency, the renminbi, was included for the first time in the special drawing rights of the International Monetary Fund. Mm-hmm. What are these special drawing rights? It is essentially a global reserve currency managed by the IMF, which is a basket which includes 5 currencies. Until July 2015, the currencies were 4: the US dollar, the euro, the British pound, and the Japanese yen. After July 2015, the inclusion had the renminbi also. So the basket now has these 5 currencies. Mm-hmm. That was a major decision by the IMF. Why? Because the renminbi, unlike the other 4 currencies, is not a convertible currency and does not yet the criteria for reserve status. In other words, as in many other cases where China has surprised the world and challenges our logic, right, because China does certain things and we think it should be different, also in the monetary field is happening the same. The Chinese currency, the RMB, has become a reserve currency for the IMF and many other central banks, even if the RMB does not meet the reserve status criteria. That's quite challenging for our mind. Why it doesn't meet the reserve status criteria? Again, as I mentioned before, it is not yet convertible. The Chinese central bank is not fully independent from the political power. The Chinese Communist Party still controls what the central bank does, and also the extent of the capital markets in China is not as deep and free as it would require to have a reserve status criteria. So for different reasons that economists and monetary experts know very well, the renminbi, the Chinese currency, is offering us this intellectual conundrum. It has become, by fact, a reserve currency, yet it does not meet the criteria for reserve currency. Now, why then the IMF decided to include such a currency in the basket of the special drawing rights? But mainly because of the Europeans. In July 2015, the debate in the West, in particular in Washington, was that the Chinese currency should not be included in the IMF basket because, again, it did not meet the criteria for reserve status. The Europeans, on the contrary, although recognizing this, decided to support unanimously the inclusion of the renminbi in the IMF reserves. That was a major split within the Western alliance, and it was a political split. The Europeans knew very well what the Americans knew, that the Chinese currency did not meet the criteria I explained before, yet they supported the inclusion with the Chinese currency. Why? A political decision, probably taken to recompensate, to thank you what China had done previously in support of the Eurozone. Now, in July 2022, last year, again, a similar thing happened. The IMF had to review its basket of currencies, and they decided to increase the share of the renminbi inside the basket, which means that the Chinese currency now has more weight inside the special drawing rights managed by the International Monetary Fund. Guess who approved, who was in favor of such an enlargement of the weight of the renminbi? The Europeans. Who was a bit more skeptical about that? The Americans. So now we have here two examples of how the Europeans and the Chinese, for different reasons, coming from different sides and different visions about world order and their relationship with the United States, coming from two different sides, they have come together to support each other monetary ambitions and eventually challenge the predominant role of the dollar in the global economy. I mentioned the Chinese support during the Eurozone crisis. I also mentioned how the Europeans supported the inclusion of the renminbi in the IMF, and even it's a bigger weight of the renminbi